I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So as usual, we have a packed lineup for you today, both at home and abroad. We're going to go first to Ben to talk about why all of a sudden, quote unquote sudden, we are hearing from Obama once again. And I think there's some really interesting, both directly what he said and how he's inserting himself into the debate, and also some, what that means for who's really in charge in DC. I'm going to talk once again about a DC topic, mostly peaceful demonstrations in DC over the weekend. Then we're going to go to Emily. We're going to talk about trust in media hitting an all-time low, which is impressive given how low it has been for quite some time. And finally, we're going to close out with Will talking about the calls for ceasefire and the two-state solution delusion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to kick us off.
So to Inez's point, Barack Obama has emerged publicly, but in some ways, he really never left Washington. I think he's maybe the first president in the last 100 years plus to actually remain in Washington, D.C. with a primary residence. Subsequent to his presidency, we know that he played a substantial role behind the scenes in helping pave the way for Joe Biden to, let's not forget, emerge from the wilderness, essentially, in the 2020 Democrat primary to ultimately prevail. We know that Joe Biden's cabinet is dominated by ex-Obama administration officials, particularly on the national security and foreign policy side of things. Tablet did some excellent reporting dating back several months, weeks at least, where it was reported that Barack Obama was regularly essentially holding salons at his house with those in key political positions. And now all of a sudden, Barack Obama has emerged on the scene in a couple major ways. The, I guess, maybe more minor one, but substantively significant one is that it's come out that he essentially played an integral role in drafting a Biden administration executive order regarding artificial intelligence development. That's a big deal in Joe Biden's words, that a former president, the predecessor to Joe Biden on the Democrat side, is actually helping draft executive orders. And this is a Barack Obama who, let's not forget, has publicly kind of imagined, well, it would be great if I could be behind the curtain. I think he said in an interview with Stephen Colbert some years ago, talking about how if he could actually be dealing with all the policy, but not the front man for it, he'd love to be in that position. Well, that appears to have occurred in this case. And then more notably, in a clip that went very viral, the former president speaking with the Pod Bros on a panel took a position which is further left than any president present or past in terms of the Israeli-Arab war, in talking about how essentially putting forth his pseudo-professorial view that, well, on the one hand, Israel, is justified in this way, and on the other hand, the Arabs are justified in this way. And really, in his own words, all of us are complicit, although he made it seem like it's the rest of the world, not himself, who are complicit, and that none of us have clean hands. But this was a message that was telling in a number of ways, beyond the fact that it was Barack Obama's policy reinstituted under Joe Biden that aided, abetted, and enabled the ascendancy of Iran and the funding and arming and coordinating of all of its proxies, which directly contributed ultimately to this worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, with the equivalent of 50,000 Americans slain in a day. Beyond that, the fact that he staked out this position was interesting. And the fact that he is public and open about this position is very interesting. So, I think this also, it's worth noting, comes against the backdrop of David Axelrod, former senior advisor to President Obama, essentially saying that Joe Biden is weak and that maybe he should consider stepping aside, in not so many words. Polling numbers indicating just how dire the situation looks for Joe Biden. James Carville as well has come out and questioned the staying power of Joe Biden. Put all of this together, and it leads to, kind of basic questions about why is it that this former president is so involved now and is suddenly speaking out publicly on major issues of public concern. And there are a few hypotheses that I would put forth, but I'm curious about speculation on all sides because I think it's pretty clear that Barack Obama is the power in the Democrat Party at the end of the day, and who brings together all of the wings of the Democrat Party. So one thing I think is in staking out the most left-wing possible position on the Israel-Arab war, he is trying to keep together a coalition that is fractured right now. I've said it's between Barack and a hard place about the ascendant squattian vision of the party versus the more traditional Democrats who probably exist as voters in far larger numbers, but are not going to be the ones who make ultimately the difference necessarily in swing states like in Michigan, for example. So I think in some ways, Barack Obama is trying to keep this fractured coalition together. Another is he's trying to run interference and protect his own legacy because this really is a third term of Barack Obama, but he wants to defend himself and also absolve himself of sin by saying that, well, this is on all of us, never taking responsibility himself and for the policies that have been put forth by the very people he handpicked to run national security and foreign policy under Barack Obama. Another aspect is he injecting himself into the news cycle because ultimately he is going to play a front and center role in playing kingmaker should Joe Biden be pushed to step aside and to coordinate the successor to Joe Biden in the Democrat Party? I think that's something that's likely possible. So I would kind of put it to the group, what do you make of the fact that he is upfront and public right now, obviously, about a year out from Election Day 2024. What is the palace intrigue that's going on here to the extent it exists?
Yeah, I'll jump in here, and I'm glad you mentioned that Axelrod op-ed, which all but directly calls for Joe Biden to step aside. And then in terms of the Israel policy itself of this administration, I honestly felt like the Obama coming out coupled with Bernie making a statement. Bernie is sort of the left flank of the Democratic Party, the last stop of the left flank of the Democratic Party that still very clearly works with its establishment. And so I think the combination of Obama is still the de facto head of the party, despite Biden being president, and Bernie coming out and both drawing a pretty pro-Palestinian line on this just reflects the bottom-up transformation reaching the top, right? So we had these 500 staffers anonymously circulate this letter criticizing the Biden policy. Obviously, the squad has been out there criticizing Biden's support for Israel. But to have these two, I almost gag on the words, but scions of the Democratic Party, right, come out and weigh in on this, to me, that puts a time clock. And if I were, making decisions in Israel, I would take into account the fact that there is now a time clock for a policy change in the Biden administration. I wouldn't expect Biden, with his record of always being perfectly in the center of whatever his party wants at any given time, to hold out against that combination of sort of staffers and poll numbers among young people from below, and now these two leaders of the Democratic Party, major leaders of the Democratic Party, Obama and Bernie, coming out at the top. I would be surprised to see Biden stand up to that. And then in terms of Obama himself, I continually, and I guess this is how people who are maybe older than us feel all the time, but it is truly shocking to watch things you lived through get so rewritten. Obama has a reputation for moderation that is just unbelievable, given those of us who actually remember and lived through his presidency, right? Obama was, in many ways, we're always looking for tipping points. To me, that I see the tipping point for the long march through the institutions that began, decades prior as the Obama presidency, where the new left finally sees the highest office in the land. A lot of the things that we take for granted about left and right today really started under Obama to emerge in the Democratic Party, as opposed to in educational institutions, universities, and so on, from the Iran policy that was mentioned, but also, the proto-BLM sympathies, right? Trayvon looks like my son, like weighing into these racial, sort of racial media flashpoints, the anti-colonial and anti-colonialism factor. That was discussed, but then it was deemed racist to discuss his sort of anti-colonial views. And then, his connections to Reverend Wright, the weaponization of the IRS against conservative groups. A lot of these things, these turning points that we now take for granted, and the sort of depth of the rot in our institutions and the fact that the Democratic Party stands for that, most of that really came into fore under Obama's presidency. So the reputation that he has for being sort of soft-spoken and moderate is wholly undeserved.
Yeah, I think I guess I'd have one simple explanation. The guy's a big narcissist. I mean, it's not as front and center as with somebody like Trump, where he's, it's sort of obvious that Trump is very egocentric just in the way he talks. But Obama's a little more stealthy about his narcissism, but he's still a big time narcissist. Like, you read any of his writing, it's me, 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 me. And that comes through. And like, so why is he trying to take credit for policy? Why is he trying to do all this? Well, he has a big ego he wants to gratify. I don't necessarily think there's anything deeper than that. That said, it's a really good reminder to see him back on the scene, that he personally was the architect of a lot of what's going wrong in the Middle East, deciding to elevate Iran, seeing it as a regional power, doing the Iran deal, giving them a huge amount of money, which ultimately ended up in the hands of Hamas, who used it to butcher over 1,000 Israeli civilians exactly 1 month ago. Not exactly the policy expertise you want. So yeah, guy's a big narcissist, and it would be better if he just like shuffled off into retirement from public life. Let's put it that way.
Just really quickly, I agree wholeheartedly with what Inez said, in that I think there's a lot of truisms about today's Democratic Party that were ushered in by Barack Obama. And before Barack Obama, he was sort of he was trying to be this almost like radical leftist constitutional professor at the same time as he was the aw shucks Illinois senator. And it was always a really interesting combination. But I think what that did was really give a permission slip for the radicals in the Democratic Party to start mainstreaming and normalizing a lot of their views about the United States. His kind of so-called apology tour really early in his presidency, I think, really set the tone for the Democratic Party. And it made a lot of things okay for Democrats. A lot of just sort of anti-American things okay for Democrats in a very, I don't know, Howard Zinn facile way. And we've never really recovered from that.
Yeah, I guess here's the moderator's prerogative to transfer it to myself. I think it's worth taking note of the ramping up of the protests around the country. I'm going to focus on DC. So it appears that quote unquote passionate protest is the new, mostly peaceful. So we're seeing increasing violence in these large protests, and the size of them is not shrinking but growing, which they're I think indicates that we are moving into more of something like a mini 2020 sort of environment with general left-wing protest. And that really straddles the line between legitimate protests and violence. Obviously, there was a lot once again, and this is so symbolic, and I don't think we should ignore the importance and symbolism of it. Once again, there have been attacks on statues in Washington, D.C. The statues, various statues to Andrew Jackson, some of the like I think Logan Circle, some of the other statues in DC have been defaced. There's been, red paint splashed all over the White House. We'll, leave aside the obvious comparisons of what's going to happen to people who violate federal law in this way versus what happened to the January 6th protesters. You can guarantee they will not be throwing the book at these protesters, but I'm not quite sure yet. I think it's too early to tell, but I think we might be gearing up for another sort of season of protest the way that we did in 2020, which only heightens the feeling that what actually took place in 2020 is a kind of a soft regime change. And the fact that these American hero statues are continually the target of these protests, I think shows in a very tangible and symbolic and obvious way that there is this merger happening. This is not merely about what is happening abroad, as appalling as that is, right? This is not merely about being pro-Hamas. It is the merging of the United States, and the view of the left as the United States is also an occupying colonial power, right? And slotting in America alongside Israel, and slotting in white people alongside Jews, right? As in the oppressor class that is therefore morally legitimates any kind of violence against the oppressor class. And I think we're seeing that structure come together on the left, which, again, to reference the first segment, will make it very difficult, I think, for the Biden administration to maintain the policy that they have had towards Israel, even as, we have criticized it and called it a bear hug, right? But I think it'll become increasingly difficult for the Biden administration even to maintain that posture in the face of this pressure in his party, both from above and below. I also want to note, just because it's in the same category, there was this, Peachy Keenan called it on Twitter a sort of a proxy violence, an orgy of proxy violence, of melting down this Lee statue from Charlottesville and actually filming it. And of course, it set off an iconic meme. But I think all of these things, to me, the symbolism matters in all of this, and it is an attack on American legitimacy. If you talk to almost any of these folks on the left who are either tearing down the posters of kidnapped Israelis and Americans, or are chanting from the river to the sea, if you ask them, they will in fact tell you that yes, America is an illegitimate country as well. We are also colonial occupiers of the land, and the land should be turned over to the remnants of the Ohlone or whatever else. And so I think it's important to understand that one, we're going to see these protests continue and perhaps become more violent. There was, unfortunately, a elderly man, a 65-year-old man in LA, was killed at one of these protests when he was bashed in the head and knocked over by a pro-Palestinian protester. That news is likely going to circulate, more than it has, because it happened recently. It's circulating in national news today, and tomorrow we're recording this, of course, on Tuesday. But I think we're likely to see this like circular or cycle of protests, is what I meant to say, consistently every weekend now, for the foreseeable future. And I think it's likely to lead to the kind of lawless environment, at least in hopefully a more minor way, but still reminiscent of the summer of 2020. So I'm curious what you guys think about the protests at home. I know we've covered extensively the connections with universities, but now it seems to me to have sort of left that context and become, once again, the left on the street, sort of organized leftist protests on the street that borders into violence that we saw in 2020.
Well, reports from the protest in DC this weekend are absolutely wild. There's some of the scenes that my colleagues saw while they were covering it, chants of intifada. There are actually videos of intifada being chanted in the streets not far from the White House, and we're just sort of collectively shrugging as though that's a totally normal thing to happen. I think there a lot of people have sort of had knee-jerk, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, knee-jerk reactions about some of these protests, and saying, is there a way to deport people, or are there people that shouldn't be here that are leading these protests, or is there any foreign money going into these protests? Some of those questions are valid. I also just think the point is, they are here. They do live here. And that's downstream of our policies over the course of years to not have a system that people want to anymore. I mean, it used to be an incredible honor to be an American because you would assimilate into America. Sorry, one second. That used to be a very good thing. But now it's, we've completely lost sight of that. So anyway, that I think is on full display. Like, you should be so proud to be an American. You shouldn't deeply hate the United States if you're going to be here. And I just look around and wonder, why are you here? What are you getting out of the United States? You're getting safety and material comfort, which is exactly what you want. So do you not realize how some of that is fundamentally rooted in what America can give to you, can give to the world? It's really, really, it's been really hard to watch, the scenes from Dearborn, for example. So anyway, it feels like we're back in 2012, something like that.
Yeah, I think to me, it's a good reminder for people of like why it's absolutely insane for anybody right-wing or conservative to be trying to align themselves with pro-Palestine sympathies. This movement is part of the global left. Like, I think there was that video clip that went out of Judith Butler calling Hamas and Hezbollah part of the global left. Judith Butler, by the way, a pretty famous liberal gender theory, leftist gender theorist. And everybody was kind of mocking her, but her point was well taken. That's exactly right. Hamas and Hezbollah are part of the global left. So if you're sitting there sympathizing with these people and being critical of Israel and the way that it's dealing with them, you are not doing the work of the right. That is for sure. Israel is one of the few right-wing countries in the world, in the Western world, rather. And I think that's one independently very good reason for Americans to support it. Also, one other kind of random point about this. Yes, we're not going to see the same sort of prosecutions. And a big part of that is because of our unequal justice system. But another big part of that is because the left is very good and experienced at protest-related crime. They have a very good institutional setup with the National Lawyers Guild to have lawyers help them. They instruct their protesters and rioters on how to avoid criminal prosecution by not bringing their phones to the location and covering their faces, so you can't prove that they're there. So it is very, very challenging to prosecute these people. Hopefully, jurisdictions that have sound leadership will do things like ban public mask wearing. Also, that would have the side benefit of helping some of our hypochondriacs get a grip on reality. But besides that, I think it would be a very good thing for public order.
Yeah, so Will raised a good point. The left has been engaging in insurrections for decades, and so they're much more effective at it and know how to skirt the law. Although I have to imagine that even if, quote unquote, those on the right adapted the same tactics, that they'd still probably get railroaded, and the left would not. That said, just a couple points. The notion of the statues and the teardown of statues or the defacing of statues, it always starts with statues and ends with people. And I think we're getting dangerously close to that point of the violence in the streets turning into pogroms here at home, and not just against Jews, but against anyone who essentially stands for Western civilization in the face of chants of intifada, which might as well equal insurrection plus Holocaust combined. In terms of the protests themselves, I think it's worth keeping tabs on whether or not we see street violence and agitation start to mushroom in the coming months. In 2020, let's not forget, going into Election Day, you had shopkeepers, commercial centers covering up their windows in major cities with the expectation that there would be violence. And what is the point of that? One of the points of it is to say, you better vote Democrat or else we're going to wreak havoc. That is actually what the message is at the end of the day. It's voting under intimidation. And well, do you really want to vote against these people? Why don't we give them what they want? It's too painful when we're going to have to deal with the constant vigils in the streets for democracy and such. Let's just make the noise go away and then elect more disastrous leaders like the ones we currently have. I also think that, the cynical leveraging of the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust to then fearmonger about Islamophobia, there's an end to this. And I think part of the end is they're going to try and use any and all backlash against the administration's policies as it continues to put the screws to Israel, and for simple voices, speech, criticizing those policies. They're going to use that as a pretext to go after the critics. And we're going to see a ratcheting up and an escalation, I think, of the censorship to criminalization pipeline that's been built in this country. So we'll see if that plays out. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Islamophobia isn't used as the cudgel to further assault our speech, but that's probably where we're heading, while the left cynically uses now its devotion to free speech to try and justify speech that is not justifiable on college campuses and beyond, and that truly is about inciting violence and ultimately murder.
Yeah, anyone who believes those free speech calls from the president of Harvard is I probably shouldn't say what I was about to say, but you're an idiot. You're a useful idiot if you take those calls for free speech seriously. Now let's kick it over to Emily to talk about a new low for media, which has been excelling in hitting new lows for recent decades.
Yeah, that's true. And basically, it affects absolutely everything because people vote based on what they read in the media. People make political decisions based on what they read in the media. So essentially, everything in society is downstream of the media coverage. We have to be able to rely on that sort of window into public affairs, not being smudged and cracked, but of course now it is. And we're talking about two wars right now. We're talking about a war in Ukraine. We're talking about the war in the Middle East. And so as we have those conversations, I think it's well worth pausing and looking at Gallup's annual media confidence numbers. They released these within the last month, and they actually matched the record low that was set in 2016. This is incredibly significant. I remember, and I think I've shared this before, when Donald Trump was elected president, being pretty stressed about the chaos around the country, not on a partisan level, but just looking around the country and just being stressed. It felt like many people shared this sentiment. It felt like we were being torn apart at the seams. And I thought to myself, if there's one good thing that could come from this, it would be that the media now has been fully rattled out of complacency. It recognizes this is a media's opportunity to recognize. I mean, the host of Celebrity Apprentice just beat the former Secretary of State in a presidential race. A reality television star just beat the former Secretary of State in a presidential competition. And none of you saw it coming. You all said she was definitely going to win. He won. And if there's any opportunity for the media to truly self-correct, it is now. And that's when they hit the record low in Gallup's polling. Trust and confidence in media hit a record low in Gallup's polling. Gallup does great polling on this because it's over time. It's consistent. They've been doing the same thing for years. So it's actually a really helpful barometer. And now we are back to that record low. So in other words, things have not improved. What we saw was a sugar high among Democrats in the Gallup polling for a couple of years after. Their trust in media rocketed up because they just couldn't get enough Jim Acosta and whomever else. But they're actually also back down. Like that has gone down too. So instead of this major moment for self-correction that we are now almost a decade has transpired since this major moment for self-correction in the media. If anything is going to correct the media, it was that. That was 2016. It's now 2023, almost 2024. And trust in media is exactly where it should be. It's sad because we need to have high trust in media and for our system to function. We need to have a good media for our system to function, but it's also good. I would be much more concerned if people had high trust in media at this very moment. So the numbers basically are people who say they have a great deal / fair amount of confidence in media. That number is at 32%. It's essentially a mirror image of what it was back in 1973 when Gallup started asking this question. People who say they have not very much confidence in the media, that's at 29%. And people who say they have none at all is at 39%. That number was at 6% in 1972. 6% in 1972. Imagine a country where 6% of people say they have no confidence at all in the media. A whole lot of those people were probably on the left at the time. But anyway, all this is to say, what a horrible place to be in when we have two wars going on, a presidential election coming up, 4 indictments against the leading candidate for the Republican nomination, and a whole host of other things. I'll just end before I toss it out to everyone to mention the new Dow Prize. I can continue on this in final thoughts, but my part-time job is director of the National Journalism Center. We just launched a Pulitzer competitor last week that ended up going to the Twitter files. The judges were our board of governors, who all voted in a very scientific way on 3 criteria: depth, public interest, and fairness and accuracy. We're a conservative nonprofit. We train journalists, and we were happy to give that award to a leftist like Matt Taibbi, and people who aren't openly conservative because they did damn good journalism. Wikipedia tried to scrub it from Matt Taibbi's page, saying that it was a partisan award, blah blah blah. Meanwhile, the Pulitzers, of course, had awarded Russia Gate Pulitzer Prize. They give the 1619 Project a Pulitzer Prize. So basically it's about restructuring the incentive system and giving journalists incentives to do good journalism instead of incentives to do bad journalism, like perpetuating the Russia collusion hoax. Because if you want to get a Pulitzer today, do bad journalism, do partisan narrative-driven journalism. So we want to evaluate the incentives and change those incentives. So I guess maybe that's a bright spot, a self-interested bright spot. But these numbers are truly terrifying. I'll toss it to the group on that note.
Yeah, I'm so glad that is doing this prize, this Dow Prize. Emily, I really do think conservatives underestimate how much, not just the money, but the prestige and honor involved with these institutions, even though we see them as what they are, which are, wearing the skin suit, whoever came up with that, wearing the skin suit of these institutions that had rightly been given this kind of trust and honor in the past. A lot of people still see that skin suit and think it's the real thing. It's so important for us to have parallel ways to award and incentivize good journalism, among other things. I only have one brief remark about this, which is, in addition to all the things that Emily said about, the power of the media, obviously people do vote based on what they read in media. I know that we have some hope that new media like this podcast and also, some of the other shows that Emily is associated with, right? We have this new media ecosystem. And we're hoping that eventually trust in media falls far enough that those can have a real mainstream impact. People doing real truthful journalism can have a real impact in that way. But I wanted to point out one very powerful tool that establishment and legacy media still has that we are going to have a really hard time replicating until well past a tipping point, that is so important. That is the ability to push politicians on their unpopular policies. We just do not have access, for example, to Democratic politicians, and the one-way ratchet that it creates, it makes possible in the Democratic Party for their politicians to never be asked. Like, think about the way that Republicans are asked about rape and incest exceptions, 0.1% for abortion constantly in every media, interview about that subject. In the exact opposite way, Democrats are never pushed on their very fringy cultural left positions. They're never pushed on positions that in the American electorate are, 80-20 positions, because the media is not just an arm of the Democratic Party, but an arm of the left flank of the Democratic Party. So they never have to answer those kinds of questions. And those policies that are so unpopular never come to the fore of the mainstream media narratives. And I think that's a power that they still have, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that the media is not trusted. It doesn't deserve any trust at all. I don't want to go back to a world where everybody thinks they're telling the truth when they aren't. I think basically what based on what Inez just said, like, they still have some of this power, and what we need then is just to delegitimize them more and more and more. Maybe we won't have that reciprocal power in any event, but I think the idea that we want to weaken them as much as possible is correct. I think the ultimate, the best solution that we have to this rampant problem of like lies and nonsense spewed both on social media and in the mainstream media is ultimately something like the effective implementation of community notes on Twitter, for I guess X now. That's the one thing that actually seems to get things right. It's very rare that I read a community note and it is inaccurate or false. Like, I trust community notes more than any single mainstream outlet by far. And I think we need more of that. Like, we can't trust Wikipedia. That's has the same exact problems where they're controlled by leftist gatekeepers. And hopefully, one of the many reasons I think we should work to protect Elon Musk and X is because in the way he has rejuvenated community notes and made it actually a serious attempt to discern truth from falsehood is remarkable.
So a minor point and then a follow-up on the social media aspect of all of this. It is very striking, and we'll see. I mean, if the history books are written by this brand of journalists and academics, then it won't be written this way. But it is remarkable that the response to 2016 and other times where the media admitted that it had blind spots and got things horribly wrong is that their response is gaslight harder. Let's actually double, triple, and quadruple down on everything that they did. You can see this obviously in the fact that there was no handing back of the Pulitzers relating to all things Russiagate. It speaks for itself in terms of how the media feels, because they felt that they were doing their job, and their job was not just to be adversarial, but it was to ultimately try and kill and take out the other side and to rectify what they perceived to be their failures, that the bad orange man prevailed in 2016. On the social media point, I think it's important to emphasize that one of the reasons that the legacy media has these tattletales that go after people on social media and hound the social media companies to censor people and go after the likes of libs of TikTok And the fact checkers do the same. And you have the concerted effort, obviously, against Elon Musk now, is because social media poses a huge threat to the entire business model of regime media. If there can be dissenting voices and anyone can be a journalist and anyone can do a fact check, and obviously, I'm speaking sort of colloquially there. I mean, but in terms of the fact that anyone can have a camera and capture something in real time, anyone can put forth a view and others might find it compelling, and it could undermine an establishment media narrative, which is to say a government narrative, that poses an existential threat to the regime. And obviously the government feels the same way, because if you think of the legacy media as stenographers for our state, then obviously it means that they can't have competition via social media. So this all points to how critical, how imperative it is to actually have something resembling a free and open digital public square. And obviously that's under heavy assault, and we'll see ultimately how it plays out both in the courts and in Washington, D.C. in the immediate months ahead.
And with that, we'll close out with our last segment for kicking it to Will to talk about the ceasefire calls and the two-state solution calls.
Yeah, so I was watching CNN on Sunday night, and it was Ali Velshi interviewing Naftali Bennett, and I'm sorry, MSNBC is where this happened. And I mean, it was an obnoxious interview by Velshi for a variety of reasons. He was just like making personal attacks on Bennett for no reason and doing a variety of things. But it was clear that Velshi had no interest in talking about the war. I mean, his very first question was on Israel's willingness to continue with the idea of the two-state solution. And it's not the first person who I've seen, like a lot of, we have Obama and even Biden and Blinken talking about, oh, we need to make it possible to have a two-state solution. And then they're also talking about the need for a ceasefire. So first off, the two-state solution is just one of these, dinosaur ideas that maybe, I guess, sounds good, but just it's from the 90s, and it never worked, and it's bizarre. And when you think about what does that actually mean? It means Israel allows for the existence of a truly sovereign state of Palestinians in either or the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. And Gaza actually had most of that, right? They had meaningful self-government. They just didn't have the ability to import military and build up a military to the, free as freely as they want to. And that ultimately is the big distinction between that sort of self-government and a true sovereign state, is you can build a real military. So wait a second. Why on earth is the solution to the conflict in the Middle East giving a terrorist organization a full-fledged military? That's actually what the two-state solution means in practice. It means giving military sovereignty to these places. Is the idea that once they had military sovereignty, that's the one thing they really wanted, and they will use that military sovereignty in a purely peaceful way? No. It strikes me as a recipe for a much, much greater war. And then the second thing to connect to that is that the same people who are calling for this two-state solution are calling for an immediate ceasefire. Okay, so you are in fact saying, maybe there's some argument of the two-state solution that says, oh, well, the Palestinian Authority has calmed down and settled down. They could be trusted with a sovereign military. Okay, but you want a ceasefire. You don't want Hamas gone. Remember, Hamas threw out the Palestinian Authority when it took power in 2006, I believe. And so if you want a ceasefire now and you want Hamas to just be able to reconstitute itself, and you want a two-state solution, you want to give a sovereign military to a terrorist organization. There's no two ways about it. That's that is the outline of the policy of this sort of left, right? Not necessarily the hard left, which obviously thinks Israel should be destroyed, but the sort of soft left, Biden, Blinken, and the Democrat administration. And that doesn't make any sense. And I think what happens is, it's amazing how, despite the completely changed reality in Israel in the past 3 decades, that people are still putting forward this idea of a two-state solution. And that basically they imagine a hypothetical Palestinian state that just behaves peacefully and is wonderful and is the realization of every Palestinian's dreams, when there is no reason to think that is what a real Palestinian state would be like. It's like basically a lot of these people have disdain for every single actual government in the Middle East, Israel included, but also Saudi and all of them. But they've imagined just a utopian vision of a Palestinian state in their minds, and that Israel is just getting in the way of that. And I think in general, the two-state solution needs to be thrown in the dustbin, precisely because there's no reason to expect that it would be democratic, that would actually increase the voting rights of people, given that with the self-government they've had, Hamas hasn't had an election in forever, and even Abbas and the West Bank canceled elections in 2021. So there's no reason to think it'd be more democratic. There's no reason to think it would be peaceful. And there's just reason to think that they would use the opportunity and the sovereign control of the territory to build up even more military strength to use to attack Israel. So that's what I think. I think the two-state solution should be in the dustbin. And I think it's particularly absurd for people who want a two-state solution to be advocating for a ceasefire with Hamas, because Hamas would be an insane peace partner, given that they want Israel gone.
So I'll make a couple brief comments. The first thing is the emphasis on two-state solution within weeks of, again, the worst slaughter since the Holocaust, equivalent of 50,000 plus Americans killed, Holocaust level atrocities that the Palestinian Arabs were proud of and wanted circulated on social media for all to see. And the response is, let's give Palestinian Arabs a state. That's the response to that sort of genocidal, jihadist, Jew-hating effort from an entity in Hamas that was elected in Gaza, whose leaders, according to polling, are more popular than the Palestinian authorities, leaders who are supposedly the moderates, which, by the way, Mahmoud Abbas, a Holocaust denier, groomed by the KGB, like Yasser Arafat before him. Go take a look at his dissertation. And then, obviously, the Jew hatred is intrinsic and pervades across the vast majority of the Palestinian Arab population. So it's a totally asinine proposition, underscored by the fact that the other Gulf Arab nations have all had their own brushes with Palestinian Arabs, and Palestinian Arabs have been responsible for assassinating the leaders of other Gulf Arab nations, which is one of the reasons why the likes of the Egyptians and others are not amenable to taking in refugees from Gaza at this very moment. So, one aspect is it's just galling that you're even raising this prospect. You're going to reward essentially one of the worst jihadist attacks ever propagated, ever perpetrated, with this notion that actually Palestinian Arabs now deserve a state. The other aspect is it's based on this premise essentially that Israel's existence as it is the central problem. And if Israel just gave up more land, that suddenly it would work. And that this isn't about, at the end of the day, a Judenrein Israel, which is, of course, the end state and would be the end state if there was a quote unquote Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. So ultimately, it's about Israel's destruction from a dysfunctional people that is effectively being rewarded by the Biden administration in the rhetoric and then also in the action of, obviously, these quote unquote ceasefires, which are basically called for. Ceasefires are humanitarian pause euphemism for it, which of course will just allow Hamas to reorganize, change its maneuvers, recuperate, resupply itself, and dig in for a much longer and bloodier battle ultimately, which serves to the benefit of no one. So the most humanitarian thing that could be done would be for the world to come together and exert maximum pressure over Hamas and its aiders, abettors, and enablers to let all hostages go, surrender tomorrow, and have Hamas's leaders be put on trial for war crimes. The fact that that is obviously not happening totally proves that the notion that this is about humanitarian concern is total BS. It's a total lie and it's a fraud, and it should be called out as such.
I mean,
go ahead, Inez.
Emily. I want to take a step back from thinking about giving a state to Palestinian Arabs and wondering, so Israel has this reason to exist, right? That is very concrete. And I think that's why when Will said that Israel is a right-wing state, I don't know how much I agree fully with that description, but to the extent that I agree with it, I think that's it. It's simply grasping the notion that, that there's a war for survival and that they're going to refuse to lie down and die and to disappear, right? This is something the West broadly has a problem with. This very simple notion of taking your own side in a battle for survival, the West broadly seems to increasingly have a problem with. And I think we see it in these discussions about, Israel and Palestine so clearly. I think every time I hear some of these discussions, even from people who are like elected Republicans, many of whom are even conservative elected Republicans who I agree with and want to see succeed in elections, and the discussion about what it is that separates Israel and Palestine is about things like, well, Israel recognizes, and this is complicated anyway, but Israel recognizes gay marriage, right? As though that's the defining characteristic between civilization and barbarism. And I think it just really underscores the point that Wellebeck has made in his writings, that there is no vision of the good that the West can stomach advancing about itself as a way even of countering what is obviously 7th century barbarism, right? And I think that, there's a reason that the ties, the quote unquote global left ties between Judith Butler and the sort of woke American university crowd and people who are extremely certain about what they want out of life, right? They're very direct. They'll tell you, they want to die killing Jews. There is, to me, that dichotomy represents in a very real way the fact that the West has failed to give a reason to people to support their own survival as the American nation, as the civilization that came up between the cradle of Athens and Jerusalem. And I know this is a bit of an abstract point, but I do think that is what comes up for me every time I hear some of these debates about whether it's ceasefire or two-state solution, right? It's this inability to understand, one, that different peoples are motivated by wholly different impulses, something that, the West really cannot understand. And two, that we have no similarly motivating impulse towards the things that are good about our civilization. And that makes me, that makes me very cynical and depressed about the trajectory of the West, whether that's in supporting Israel or our existence ourselves.
So actually on that somewhat abstract point, the idea that Israel is the biggest obstacle towards the two-state solution, as a lot of people on the left like to talk about, is just absolutely absurd and bizarre. I spend a good deal of time talking with people on the left and have over the last month. As we're recording this, it's November 7th. It has been a month. They'll point to Ben-Gvir or, other people that are in the Israeli government and say, there's extremism in the Israeli government. It's like, well, so Hamas is the Palestinian government, and they just mounted an intentional campaign of civilian slaughter, terrorism. It's just such a stupid point. And obviously I think it's definitely time for countries to think about. I mean, it's 2023. So again, we see some of this as ancient history, and there's obviously some ancient history involved, but post World War II it's not ancient history. This unfolded over the course of a lot of people's lifetimes. And I think, looking at a different framework is completely appropriate because the current framework is not working. And that is abundantly clear. So to cling to it obsessively without reworking the paradigm, I think is, obviously at this point, not the right course of action. But we can't have that conversation partially because of what we talked about with the media. Nobody has accurate information. Nobody trusts that the people they're arguing against have accurate information. They don't even know that they have accurate information. And I think that has been also abundantly clear over the last month is, even people who on the left have, done the work, as they might say, and have read a bunch of books on the subject, they really don't have the full history. And that's Ben Shapiro's debate at Oxford over the last week. He's going toe to toe with some ostensibly kids who have researched this, because they were willing to go toe to toe with Ben Shapiro in public. And he like, actually, what was the one student said, something like the Allies weren't bombing civilians in World War II. It just, like, the lack of history among people who purport to understand the full history. I think that is really telling, that people who have put in the work are still missing some pieces. So with that, I'll toss it back to Inez.
Yeah, and this is our final thoughts round. I'll kick it off to avoid the now traditional long pause as people don't want to go first. Mine is a very easy point, which is, of course, it's Tuesday. As we're recording this, there are elections in some states and jurisdictions across the United States. And I want to just highlight one thing about it, which is I think that what we're seeing is the transition. It used to be that the Republican Party did better in off-year elections and midterms because they were the dedicated older voters, high information voters, whatever. And so it was sort of a fact of politics that Republicans would do better in midterms and off-year elections. And then Democrats were the ones driving mass turnout because they did better with mass turnout. I'm wondering if that's still true. I think there are some indications that it's now the opposite, that, essentially the Republican Party is more the populist party that may do better in high turnout elections than they do in low turnout elections. I'm not saying that is uniformly the case, but I think it's a way that we ought to start thinking about it. Especially when you contrast some of the recent special elections and the midterms with poll numbers for Biden in all swing states, right? +10 in Nevada, +6 in Georgia, +5 in Michigan, +5 in Arizona, +2 in Pennsylvania. These are all states that Biden won, right, in 2020. So, I mean, I it's too soon to tell, but I think that is that kind of basic building block of political consulting, right? That Republicans are actually the more organized and sort of going to do better in smaller but more niche elections. I think there's reason to doubt that, and it might very well be in the reverse these days. So yeah, that's my final thought.
So I'll just jump in and give a shameless plug and also a hat tip. The shameless plug for this report that I put out for Real Clear Investigations this week, which reveals in never before disclosed granular detail who was targeted and on what grounds they were targeted, and literally the specific tweets and Facebook posts that were targeted and what percentage of the time they were targeted by government officials or their cutouts in the 2020 election via Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA's third-party kind of private-public consortium, the Election Integrity Partnership, which was kind of the preeminent public-private cog in the censorship industrial complex in 2020. So I obtained documents showing, again, in very granular detail, everyone from elected officials to journalists, friends, perhaps some of us as well, who were caught up in this effort to mass surveil for wrongthink about election administration and outcomes, and then identify that wrongthink with specific tweets and accounts to the social media companies to get them to suppress those accounts under their terms of service. And they did so in 35% of the so-called tickets where the wrongthink was captured and categorized via this effort. So we reported in kind of granular detail on the size, scope, and nature of this censorship regime. Then the House Judiciary Committee followed up with its own report, which looked at the same records and some additional evidence that they've put forth to show just how intimately involved the feds were and may still be in policing our speech on social media, both through direct links to the social media companies and then through what appear to be cutouts and force multipliers doing business as academic or research or social media analytics companies, many of them whose personnel come from the government or who receive funding from the government as well. So check out my report at Real Clear Investigations, and then I'd also urge you to check out the Judiciary Committee and its Weaponization Subcommittee's report on this, which really provides some amazing eye-opening details as to the size, scope, and nature of the censorship industrial complex.
So I've got two interesting things coming up in not this week, but next week. Monday, I'll be in Washington, D.C. at my alma mater, Georgetown Law, on a panel with a couple of Georgetown law professors and a lawyer who was on the select committee investigating January 6th. And one of the law professors was on the special counsel team. And we will be discussing January 6th, what happened, the legal efforts against Donald Trump, and a variety of things. I have looked at the three people on the panel. I'm going to be the only person with even a remotely pro-Trump voice, and I'll be dealing with a couple of people, one of whom was on the January 6th committee, and the other on the special counsel investigation. So I have a lot of work to do to actually get prepared for that, but I think it should be really interesting. So if you're in DC, I believe it will be Monday evening of November 13th at Georgetown Law. I'll post more details on my Twitter. And then the second thing I've got coming up is a debate with Scott Horton of Anti-War Radio, a libertarian, on Israel. That debate will be on Timcast's Culture War podcast, and that will be 10 days from today on Friday morning on the 17th. Feel free to watch that. And I've had random people come up to me with things they think I should say. I am always open to hearing that on Twitter, and you can reach out to me over DM.
Well, some bittersweet news, perhaps. We're all, as you can tell from just this round of final thoughts, extremely busy, and I'm no exception to that. I'm here at my office at the National Journalism Center. As I mentioned earlier, we launched the Dow Prize last week, which was it's a $100,000 award for what we refer to as excellence in investigative journalism. Also $10,000 awards for two finalists. So that both went to the Washington Free Beacon because they did some really great journalism over the course of last year. Aaron Sabarium's series on wokeness starting to take over institutions where people don't even understand it won one of the awards, and Andrew Kerr and Joe Simonson's report on the Arabella dark money network that funds the left won another one of those awards. So we're already getting ready for next year, and that among other things, also doing some co-hosting over at Breaking Points, where I host a show with Ryan Grimm called Counterpoints on Wednesdays. That's made it difficult for me to keep the regular schedule, and we have a regular Tuesday filming schedule here at NatCon Squad. So sadly, I'm bowing out after today's episode, but believe me, it is sad. Believe me, I'll still be listening, coming back as I'm needed for substitute positions. And you know what? It's been an honor and so much fun, and I've learned so much that I just want to thank the Edmund Burke Foundation. I want to thank absolutely everybody who is has been a part of this show, and obviously keeping so many of them in our prayers and our thoughts as they're affected by the conflict in Israel. But I'm just really grateful, and I hope to see all you guys again soon. But it's sad, and I appreciate all the support. Super appreciate our producer Anna, appreciate Yoram and the whole team. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, like a true journalist, Emily scoops her own departure from the show. But as she mentioned, she will be back. She'll be filling in. It's not the last time you'll hear from Emily on NatCon Squad, but unfortunately, she's just not able to come in every week, as we have been grateful that she has been able to do with all of the many, many hats that she wears from YAF, that she was talking about, as well as Counterpoints, as well as the culture editor over at the Federalist. She's a fellow with us at IW. So she just has an endless number of things claiming her time. So the scheduling just became too difficult. But she will be back as a sub every so often. So it's not the last time you'll see Emily's lovely face on NatCon Squad. Hopefully we'll see her again soon. So on that note, on behalf of Ben, Will, and Emily, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and I'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.